I'm very proud of the honorary degree from the National and Kapodistrian University, and it was largely because of my working to organize the World Congress of Philosophy here in Athens in 2013, which was so really memorable because with extraordinary good fortune we were able to have open air sessions in the original site of Aristotle's Lyceum, as well as in Plato's Academy and up on the Pnyx and in other areas where we were really actively reliving the philosophical tradition of Greece. And at very difficult times, in the middle of a deep financial crisis. So I would just think that the Greeks did a fantastic job. Okay, the second thing I'd like to thank is thank Fotini for organizing this conference, this Husserl Circle conference. And I was telling her yesterday that I hosted it in Dublin exactly 20 years ago in 2005. And I have photographs of a very young Bert Hopkins and others, which I have shared with her, since we are honoring Bert a little bit later. Okay, so my talk today is on the sphere of ownness, the general area of my own self, which occurs many, many times in Husserl's philosophy. Husserl, as you know, was seeking to reinvigorate Cartesianism. His Cartesian way he sees as the central way. And at the end of the Cartesian meditations, he refers to the Greek gnoti salton, the know thyself, which is on the inscription of the temple of Apollo there in Delphi. So his passage in the Cartesian meditations reads, "The Delphic motto, know thyself, has gained a new signification. Positive science is a science lost in the world. I must lose the world by epoche in order to regain it by a universal Selbstbesinnung. Noli foras ire, says Augustine, inte reddit interiore, homine habit veritas." Don't go outside, the truth dwells in the inner person. And Husserl likens Descartes to Columbus and Moses, both discoverers of new worlds. In the Erste Philosophie text, he says, "Indeed, great and dark depths opened up behind the seeming triviality of the notorious pronouncement ego cogito, ego sum. It was the same for Descartes as it was for Columbus, who discovered the new continent but did not know anything about it and believed he made a new route to India." In Descartes' case, he says he failed to grasp the real nature of the principle of his grounding. He did not grasp the genuine sense of the grounding of knowledge rooted in the ego cogito. And elsewhere, in the Nachwort to Ideen 1, Husserl says that the universal horizon of phenomenological philosophy has been revealed in its main geographical structures, as it were, and the essential layers of the problems and essential methods and modes of access have been clarified. I can see spread out before me the endless open land of true philosophy. Das gelobte Land, the promised land, through its cultivation come after. So Moses arrived and saw the promised land, but did not get to lead his people into it. Descartes is the same. He discovered transcendental subjectivity, but he couldn't explore it. And in fact, as we know, according to Husserl, he fell back into a naive objectivism in the talking about this ego cogito as a res cogitant. Rather, Husserl must proceed in a more radical manner and explore this in terms of what he calls an egology. And then, as he says in Erste Philosophie, the statement, "I am," ich bin, must instead be the true principle of all principles and the first statement of all true philosophy. That's a really important. We heard yesterday about the principle of principles, which is supposed to be the pure givenness of intuition. But here the principle of principles is the ich bin. And indeed, Husserl will say, and I won't read all of this quotation, in the Cartesian meditations, that this transcendental subjectivism, as he calls it, represents the necessary final form of philosophy itself. It is a task imposed by history. So Husserl has a very strong opinion that this transcendental subjectivity needs to be explored in itself. But what is this ego to which we are returning? Let me just say that Husserl is really saying the same thing as Heidegger does in Being and Time, who Heidegger in Being and Time says, oh, you know, the cogito ergo sum, the founding principle, but no one has asked about the being of the sum. And Husserl is really saying the same thing. What is the nature of the givenness of the I, the phenomenality of the ego, as he speaks about it, phenomenality, of my concrete I myself. And this, he says, is the ego in my ownness, or the ego in its ownness. It's Selbsteigenheit, itself, to itselfness, as it were, for which Husserl uses many terms, including Innerlichkeit, a term you find in Meister Eckhart, and later on in Fichte and Schelling and in the German idealist tradition. My innerness, my sense of being in, as he says, an Innenwelt, an inner world. So the important thing that I want to stress here is that for Husserl, the ego cogito ergo sum, whatever version of it, sum, res cogitans, all of these different versions, are not just purely intellectual intuitions. They represent a kind of sensory self-givenness. That's what I'm going to explore a little bit. There is a sense not only of I'd say ownship, Eigenheit, rather than ownership. I've written on this in the paper, but I think when you own yourself, that's a legal concept, like you can sell your kidneys or you can sell your body in the sex trade or whatever. That's ownership of yourself, and it's an important legal idea. But the sense of being oneself is what I call ownship. It's the kind of thing you do when you're not sick. When you're sick, you say, I don't feel myself. I'm not myself today. Well, that's a very strange formulation. I'm not myself. I'm not feeling myself today. So what is this feeling oneself? This is what I think Husserl is trying to explore in his return to ownness. And of course, being Husserl, following Descartes, he places a great deal of emphasis on voluntary control, on the Ich kann, on the will as being the center of this self, and its capacity for ruling, controlling, governing itself, Walten. And it does that, as we'll see, through stances, taking stances. For Husserl, the voluntary capacity to take a stance, make a judgment, form a conviction, or alter a stance. Einstellung, Änderung, the change of stance required in the FOK, for example. These are all capacities of the ego, the free use of the ego, as it were. But there's other sides to it. And to me, and I'm checking this with the Husserlian scholars, and I'm open to correction, but I think this notion of the Eigensphäre or the Eigenheitssphäre is unique to Husserl. And it's also very rare in Husserl. Despite one hearing a lot about it in the Cartesian Meditations, it appears almost nowhere else except in the text notes surrounding the Cartesian Meditations that we find in Husserliana 13, 14, and 15, where he talks about Urmodales Ich, or Urpräsenz des Ich, or Das Ur-Ich in the crisis. But he even talks, as you see in this last one here, about Das Eigensensuelle. And the reason I emphasize that is, again, there are many people who think, even in the analytical world of cognitive science now, that one's sense of being oneself is accomplished of judgment. Whereas I'm saying, which kind of should be obvious in the everyday sense, that there's a feeling of being oneself, a sense of auto-affection, to use the word of Michel Henry, which is prior to, to use the language of yesterday, the pre-predicative level. It's on this level where I have a feeling of being myself, ultimately going down to a sense of temporal continuity, and stability. I'll talk a little bit more about that, of Heimlichkeit, as Stein will call it. And indeed, Husserl will never let go of this primal I. So there's this important passage in the Crisis where he says it would be wrong methodologically to jump immediately into transcendental intersubjectivity and to leap over the primal I, the ego of my epoche, which can never lose its uniqueness and personal indeclinability. So this is a very strong feature of Husserlian intersubjectivity. It's always anchored in the primal I. And this ego is, as Husserl says here in the Crisis, a unique sphere of self-evidence of such a nature that any attempt to inquire behind it would be absurd. So his whole point is that Descartes stopped on the threshold of a great discovery, the full riches of the inner ego, and instead of exploring this transcendental structures of this ego, he shifted to finding it as an anchor for building on the concept of God and the external world and so on. Now, there are a lot of people who agree that there is this Ich pole, as Husserl calls it, this I pole at the center of all subjective experience. And in one sense, this I pole can be experienced as a timeless, unchanging identity. And Husserl often describes it as such. Here's a passage from Ideen 1, where he writes, after performing the reduction to the flow, we will nowhere hit upon the pure ego as an experience among other experiences, not even as a genuine piece of experience. The ego seems to be there constantly, indeed, necessarily, and this constancy is obviously not that of an inanely persisting experience of an idée fixe. Rather, the ego is inherent in every experience as it comes about and streams away. Its focus passes through each current cogito to something objective. This radiating focus varies with each cogito, shooting forth anew with the new cogito and vanishing with it. Yet the ego is something identical. Now there's an awful lot to unpack here, which I'm not going to unpack because it's complicated. We heard yesterday about the relationship of focus or attention within the ego. But there's a strong sense in which the ego is this timeless identity pole. And he says this in the Cartesian Meditations: the ego is itself existent for itself in continuous evidence. Thus, in itself, it is continuously constituting itself as existing. Here too we have touched on only one side of this Selbstkonstitution. We have looked at only the flowing cogito. But the ego grasps itself not only as a flowing life, but as an I, who lives this and that subjective process, who lives through this and that cogito as the same I. So we are in this complicated thing that the ego, the primary function of the ego in this camp is a sort of, this almost invisible presence in each cogito is to guarantee the continuity of the flow. So he writes, each cogitatio, thought, experience can change, at least if it is considered intrinsically. It can come and go. But in contrast to the passing cogitatio, however, the pure ego seems to be something intrinsically necessary and absolutely identical in the course of every actual and possible change of experience. In Kantian language, the I think must be capable of accompanying all my representations. And Husserl has some very complicated and interesting things to say about the I think. As you know, Husserl began as a Brentanian, and Brentano really doesn't place any. Brentano is following Hume in not really having an account of the ego or thinking there's no experience of the ego. Husserl precisely thinks there's an experience of the ego, but here he's agreeing with Kant in thinking that really the ego belongs to the form of every experience. And so he glosses this in Ideas 2. He quotes the Kantian phrase, the pure ego must be able to accompany all my representations, and then says, this proposition makes good sense if we include under representations here all obscure dunkel consciousness. In principle, the pure ego can enter into any unaccomplished, unconscious, unalert, intentional lived experience. It can bring the light of alert consciousness to lived experiences that have receded into the background and are no longer being performed. But the ego holds sway, governs only in the performance of the cogitationes proper. So Husserl is here again asserting this idea that the ego really comes to its own in decision making, in stance taking. When, as he says in Cartesian meditation, I become thus and so decided. When I make a decision, it's permanent. I can change it later, but I will always have been the one who made that decision at that time. It's like I can't cancel it out, even if it's like a tattoo. You can write over the tattoo and you can rub it out, but it's always, the trace will always be there underneath. I often say to the students that this ego is like a snowball. It collects everything on its way. So every scar is added to the body and every scar is added to the life. Even if you've cancelled it, say that about me, I was never like that, I deny it, and so on. So Husserl goes even further though, and thinks that this pure ego cannot even be thought of as non-existent. And thus he writes in Ideas 2, in fact, the pure ego is nothing other than what Descartes, in his marvelous meditations, grasped with the insight of genius and established for all as being the thing which it is not possible to doubt, and which in any doubt would necessarily be found again as the subject of doubt. If there were a sense to saying that the ego is subject to generation and perishing, then we would precisely have to establish that possibility of pure givenness. And then he goes on to say, but as soon as we don't do so, the absurdity becomes plain. The pure ego as such, namely the regarding, focusing ego, on the one hand would be living in the continuity of this regarding as what is identical in the corresponding duration, and yet at the same time would have to be not being, as it were. We would have the absurdity that the absolutely existing ego, in the duality of its being, would encounter itself as not being. So Husserl thinks it's impossible to unthink yourself, if you like. So there is no possibility of self-cancellation. And this means that the ego has a permanence beyond all manifestation in the flow of consciousness. Now, I don't want this discussion to be considered to be a discussion of the relationship between the pure ego and the real ego, as it were, between the transcendental and the empirical self, or something like that. What I'm interested in exploring is the dynamic within the transcendental ego itself. And while I've established that Husserl thinks on the one hand it is it is necessary, undurchstreitbar, cannot be struck out, cannot be cancelled out, and is always present. And nevertheless, he has a story of its genesis, its origins, its continuity, its development, and its decline. And he writes here in one of his notes, every empirical ego begins as an ur-ich. Each is completely identical, and this is really interesting, except for its pre-given matter. So an ego has a pre-given matter, which I take to be a flow of sensuous and temporal contents, and the manner of its distribution in immanent time. After that, every private ego develops differently from every other. So in contrast to certain readings of Kant, who thinks perhaps there is only one transcendental ego because the transcendental ego is merely the form of all experience, and it doesn't differ from person to person. For Husserl, each person has an individual transcendental ego. Moreover, as Husserl says in the Cartesian Meditations, this transcendental ego, this centering ego, is not an empty pole of identity. That's the anti-Kantian move there. Rather, according to a law of transcendental genesis, with each act emanating from it and having a new objective sense, it acquires a new abiding property. For example, if in an act of judgment I decide for the first time in favor of being and being thus, the fleeting act passes, but from now on I am abidingly, dauernde, the ego who is thus and so decided. I am of this conviction. And in fact, the ego is really, according to Husserl, built up from these convictions, capacities, stance-takings, and habits. So many times he speaks about this. I'm just giving you some passages there from the Cartesian meditations. Each one of them, the ego is a substrat von habituality. Sorry. The ego is a pole of acts, habitualities, and capacities. It is an ego of eine bleibende Überzeugung, a remaining conviction. So this morning I wake up, I decide I'm never drinking alcohol again. And many of us do that. And we are thus and so decided. Now, for some people, that does become indeed a permanent conviction, but it has been at least a permanent moment in the evolution of my ego. And so Husserl says very clearly, there are the same number of pure egos as there are real egos. I'll jump just to the ball. Every pure ego that accomplishes the perception, I, the human being, ich Mensch, has the human ego, the person, as an object in its environment. On the other hand, your pure ego encounters itself again as the pure ego in the human being and in the person, insofar as these objects are posited with the apprehension sense, according to which the real ego includes the pure ego as in its apperceptive nuclear content. So there is a sense that the ego, that the real ego is, if you like, already conscious of itself as the pure ego. It doesn't normally do so. Why? Because normally Husserl, just like Heidegger, thinks that in our external experience, that first of all, primarily our external experience is outer focused. And in that regard, our ordinary experience runs on with no awareness of the ego and is, as it were, in the realm of das Man, or the everyday. Every experiencing or other kind of directedness towards the mental takes place in the mode of reflection. To live as ego subject is to erleben the mental in multiple ways. But this lived through life is, so to speak, anonymous. It goes on, but we're not focused on it. It is unexperienced. So it's really important to think that Husserl, just like Heidegger, saying that, as you know, Heidegger thinks that Dasein comes, as it were, in, as I say, two flavors, eigentlich and uneigenlich. And most of the time it is uneigenlich. Why? Because it's in the realm of das Man. It's going out of itself. It's being the same as everyone else, getting on the bus alongside everyone else, and so on. There's much greater depth to this, and I probably don't have time. We have maybe 10 minutes? Okay. To go into this, that as we now know from the Grenzprobleme, but already in a day in say slide, that there's discussions of the layerings of this ego. And that, again, Husserl is very clear, I'm the subject of my life, and the subject develops by living. And Edith Stein talks about this more and distinguishes between what she calls the blooming Entfaltung of the self, as opposed to the Entwicklung, or development of the self. Stein thinks, if you like, of the self as having a kern, a Persönlichkeitskern, an original seed from which we bloom. And it's a beautiful metaphor, but she develops in great depth in her Beiträge, published in the Jahrbuch in 1922. But Husserl has also this idea that the ego is, if you like, not just the pure ego, is not purely an empty pole, but also has within it this stuff, as he talks about, this ego matter, as you see here, which is a sort of pre-givenness. Must we not say, in contrast to the waking ego, the sleeping ego is completely immersed, versunken, in ego matter, in the Hule, in undifferentiated ego being, in Ich-Versunkenheit, in self-absorption. whereas the awake ego opposes itself to the matter, and then it affects, acts, it affects, acts, and undergoes. And this is a crucial passage. The ego posits the non-ego and comports itself towards it. The ego unceasingly constitutes itself over and against in this process of Selbsterhaltung. So the vision here is that the primary ego is already sort of sitting on this mass of undigested matter, which is the flow of its sensuous hule. And in, as we know, in sleeping, dreaming, and all of that, there is this mess of semi-constituted experiential content. But the ego only comes into its own when it grasps itself in position taking and wakes up and switches itself on. We heard all about this in alertness and so on. But it raises this question, which I think is ultimately unresolved. I'll say a few words about it now in the final few slides, of how, for Husserl, the ego, the transcendental ego, can be both a pure ich pole and a habitual bearer of developing capacities and so on. How is there at the same time a timeless pole and an evolving self of habits and conviction? And I'll just mention here that one version of an answer is that Dan Zahavi in particular and other cognitive scientists have been using this notion of the minimal self, which they tend to think of as merely the perspectival sense of, as he puts it, there being an experience for me-ness character. But the me here is not really has any content. It's a kind of pure subject of experience, a pure perspective or an attitude towards one's own experience that marks it as mine. And that Dan is very insistent on defending this minimal self, which he thinks has been neglected in social discussions of the social self. And there's a certain truth in it. But for Dan, this pure perspectival minimal self doesn't seem to have, at least for me in my other way of reading it, this sensory content of mindness that I'm interested in. And I want to say that I'm showing you these passages in Husserl where he seems to think there is this flow of sensory mindness, which has a kind of what it's like for me-ness, not merely as an intellectual that I occupy a perspective, but rather as a feeling that are captured by other terms. Husserl uses kinesthesis, but at exactly the same period, Charles Sherrington invented two words that are now largely adopted in the psychological literature: proprioception and interoception, which is proprioception, of course, is one's awareness of one's locatedness. As Wittgenstein says, your feet are further away from you than your hands. I mean, there's no way in which that's really true in a sense, but it feels like that. It's always harder to put your socks on than to put your gloves on. So, it's just a fact that certain parts of you are further away. So what's the center and all the rest of that? We won't get into that, but there are aspects, and I'm just giving you a few here, that Husserl doesn't really talk about, except for the spatial locatedness. It does talk a little bit, like Locke, of the sense of force and resistance in meeting up with bodies and so on. And then Husserl talks a lot about there is the sense of freedom, the sense of the ich kann. Even something, by the way, that's been developed a lot by people who are working with disability and so on. That the capacity to say, no, I don't want to do this and so on. For example, people who are required to live in wheelchairs do not like it if somebody just moves their wheelchair around out of the way. It would be like grabbing you by the shoulders and turning you around to move you. That would be inappropriate. So the sphere of mindness has a sensory feel to it and has a sense of locatedness and being oneself. And there's much more to it. I'll skip over these notions. And Husserl thinks of this self, of course, as I skip over the part, as constituted largely from the streaming of and just like Merleau-Ponty, and the Verflechtung, or intersection between touching and feeling. And he thinks of this Ich as being an Ich-Lein, that the ego is already a kind of ego in a lived body or a psychic body, as Sartre calls it. And this body is itself that which is sort of taking on new habitualities and so on. The same body which serves me as a means for all my perception obstructs me in the perception of itself and is a remarkably imperfectly constituted thing. Merkwürdig, unvollkommen constitutes Ding. And these, as we know very well from ideas too, within this sense of being oneself, there are a sense of the zero Nullpunkt der Orientierung that Husserl talks about. There are zones of familiarity and distance, again, it relates to ownership. Some people have no problem losing their hair or getting it shaved. Other people think of their hair as like a cancer patient. Losing their hair is a really traumatic moment. So, it may vary from person to person what constitutes you. There's a recent movie, Banshees of Inisherin, where somebody who's playing the violin cuts off his fingers with shears, and that's a very traumatic moment. But clipping your nails is not a traumatic moment for most people. So the zones of meanness are layers of an onion. People, as you know, there are zones if people are standing too close to you or whatever. So there is for me, and I think for Husserl, a very strong sense of what it feels to be oneself. I love this phrase from Stein: the self sinks its taproot into nature. It roots itself in nature. And there is, and Stein talks about this much more in her review of Heidegger's Being and Time. It's not published posthumously. She criticizes Heidegger for emphasizing Unheimlichkeit, translated as uncanniness or not at homeness of anxiety. She says that Heidegger primarily anchors Dasein in anxiety, in the sense of nothingness, Nichtigkeit. Whereas, in fact, she says, no, most of the time we feel at home with ourselves. We're being whole. Heidegger talks about this, being whole as something that can never happen to Dasein in one sense, because it's always Sein zum Tode, and there's always a finitude to it. But the sense of being oneself, at home with oneself, these are very strong in Husserl. And phenomenologists recently, like Frederick Svenius, have been writing about illness and especially psychological dis-ease as variations of not being at home with oneself. There is also, and I just mentioned it, of course, there's a huge interest in cognitive science in various disorders to do with location of oneself. There's all kind, I'll give you just a few of their relationships of the body, or body dysmorphias of all kinds, including the alien hand and so on. But there are also regular phenomena when one feels out of the body experiences, as it were, in dreams and so on. So there's a whole region, this is part of the zones of selfhood, if you like, that one builds up around oneself. And some people have a much more armored self than others. Some people are like, I always say that the being in the world, in the outside, you can think of that like a snail that lives inside its house, but it brings its house with it. So you bring your world with you, and that world can be a little fragile in relation to others, or it can be kind of strong in relation to others. So this is where Husserl thinks that the self that emerges from all of this morass of Triebe, instincts, drives, tendencies, capacities of already given characters, that what Stein uses the word Leibgebundenheit. we are tied, we are bodily bound. You know, no matter how much you want to free yourself, you can only jump so high, or run so fast, or eat so much, and so on. There's an absolute finitude there. But what rises above it is this sense of stance-taking, holding sway, feeling in control. And of course, this is where there are the notion of autonomy, and it's built very strongly on this sense of intimate selfhood. So what I'm saying, I think, is not really contradicting Zahavi, but I think adding to his notion of the minimal self. So I'll just finish here with this remark about Zahavi in his book Self and Other summarizes a view he had been defending for at least 10 years on the minimal self. More specifically, this is Zahavi writing, I defended the view that phenomenal consciousness involves self-consciousness in the weak sense, that there is necessarily something as like for the subject to have or live through experiences. Experiences necessarily involve an experiential perspective or point of view. They come with perspectival ownership, and rather simply of speaking of phenomenal, what is likeness, it is more accurate to speak of what it's like for meanness. However, he says, importantly, this for meanness doesn't have the character of some I qualia. Rather, it refers to the first personal character or presence of experience, in the fact that we have a different pre-reflective acquaintance with our ongoing experiential life. Well, I suppose my view is that actually it's a much fuller, sensuous auto-affection that is flowing at that level. So there's never really a minimal self. There's always already a self that is struggling to transcend the flow of the given. So I'll skip that because we're out of time, and just say I'll go to them. So thank you. Thank you.
Jacob first, Camilo, and okay, Paul, and Costas. Yes, please. Here.
So, thanks, Dermot, for a really interesting and helpful talk. I want to ask more about the connecting the stance-taking, which I think I'm totally on board with, and the ego of habitualities, and how you see that in relationship to some of the literature in phenomenology, but also in kind of analytic philosophy, where some of the sorts of things that you're talking about, so particularly bodily habitualities in one's spirit of ownness, tend to get dismissed as sort of, yeah, we can give an account of those, but they're sub-personal.
Yes.
Right, so they sort of don't really count for any kind of epistemological concern or anything like that, because they're sort of all done third personally as scientific accounts. So I'm wondering, obviously you're not giving an account of like personhood here,
not here.
but how would you connect this and think about habitualities?
Very good question, thank you. Although there are some very good books on the manner in which this life, the living sense of being one embodied, are shaping and formative of the self. You know, how the body shapes the mind. I think is one book which reminds me of with that title. There's some very, very good work being done in the Jean Nicot Institute in Paris, where they talk a lot about this auto-affection and so on in relation to what this whole area of microphenomenology. You know, that the sense of being oneself is captured very deeply, not just in our, facial tone of voice and facial expressions, which was what a lot of people thought were at least accompanying the stance-taking, but as shaping it. But I think the whole phenomenological tradition, which already with Husserl, Scheler, and Stein, emphasized that the self emerges in position-taking acts that are themselves guided by value-apprehending acts, which are found already in the emotions. So I think that you cannot have an account of the person without taking into account the set of emotional value recognition, shall we say, that are already embedded in it. And I think the accounts of that are very too complex to go into here, but they claim that the self is constituted, as Edith Stein says, from below as well as from above. So I think that the from below side is that already Husserl and Stein think there's a certain degree of facticity in that you have born with certain tastes, likenesses. I think Husserl somewhere says a baby is attracted to some sounds, another baby will cry when they hear those sounds, or certain colors. So there's a realm of givenness. This is the Bude, but it's there already shaping the ego. They're not extraneous to it. I mean, Sartre thinks you can just make a decision to make them extraneous to you, and one can see how that goes. But and this layers into some controversial areas now about self-identity, and if we go into areas like gender identity and so on, it becomes very complicated.
I was wondering, where is the space for the unconscious dimension of life when we deal with the problem of the ego in light of the problem of the sphere of awareness? And the second one is what do you think about the Sartre and Aaron Gurvich's criticism of this revival of the pure ego? What do you think about the problem of the non-ecological consciousness?
Yeah. Well, I think what I've sort of at least hinted at here is that so-called non-ecological consciousness is this outward facing of the ego in its anonymous daily life in the natural attitude for Husserl. But that daily life in the natural attitude is always already stacked with mindness, even though the mindness character is not focused on. It takes, as Husserl says, an act of epoche and reflection to discover the I within the natural attitude, because we're not focused on it. So, Husserl thinks that the very idea of a non-ecological, at least after early writing, of a non-ecological consciousness is a priori mistake. That all consciousness is egocentric for Husserl, all consciousness. So the idea of a non-ecological consciousness evaporates because it has no, this is where I agree with Zahavi, it has no for me-ness. So it's just not a subject. It's not subject. Sorry, that was answering your second question. The first question was?
The first question was about the unconscious dimension of constituting life.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of people writing now on Husserl's concept of the unconscious, which is surprisingly closer to Freud than we knew, and especially in the Grenzprobleme and other texts. But for Freud and Husserl, it's a bit like this notion of focus, and there being contextuality around it, just like Gurvich talks about. There are zones that are outside that are not in focus. They're the background, if you like, and they can come into focus. But the ideal for both Freud and Husserl is that we gain active awareness of the unconscious drives and tendencies that perhaps are shaping us in ways we didn't know. So the whole point of, for Husserl, some kind of Selbstbesinnung, is that we come to be aware of the shaping power of unconscious experiences, even if we cannot fully experience them directly. We experience their Nachwirkung. They're just like in in Freud, we experience the after effects of the trauma, you know, as it emerges in repetitive behavior, or, you know, constantly having twitches, or, you know, scratching your nose, or thinking, or shivering, or whatever. So those eruptions of the unconscious into our experience are the phenomena which we make sense of. And we do so by a reflective turning of regard. So in the end, both Freud and Husserl, in my view, want us to adopt, if you like, you know, make our own that which has been driving us mad. And by making it our own, somehow we discharge it. And that's the point of therapy, and you know, in various ways to bring it up, and then give it a sense. And once you have given it a sense, that you can sort of make it tame in your possession. I think. And Husserl talks about a having or a possession, and the idea that our higher order acts give us a freedom with regard to what is given. That's the higher level of which we absorb the unconscious. That's how I see it.
I quite like the way you were bringing Edith Stein into this conversation, and this is going to follow up somewhat Jacob's question, because I have a question about personalism, but I'd like to bring into the conversation Max Scheler and his formalismus.
Yes.
Because, so, it's just a general question. How would you bring this work into this discussion? But I want to bring it in, I want to sort of focus in on this phrase, because I was listening for the idea of personalism.
Yes.
And the only word, the only time you brought it in was with Stein's persönliche Kern, which to me really is a reference to the concept, the theory of personalism in Scheler more than in Husserl.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the sense of mindness and pure ego that you've been discussing here in relation to the theory of personalism in Max Scheler, and what you see as maybe the influence or the differences on that?
Well, first of all, I've written separately on that, a few articles and chapters coming out on this personalism and the concept of the person in Husserl, Stein, and Scheler, and von Hildebrand, and others. So there's a whole tradition there. And in the case of Stein, she was in direct relationship during her Catholic period, in the post-22 period, with people like Jacques Maritain and with French personalism, and she was very aware of it. That personalist tradition is extremely strong in France, and it is present in Scheler in the formalism, and that's where Stein gets it. But Danielle de Santos and others have shown me that the concept of Persönlichkeitskern come actually from Jean Hebry, and he talks about this unique kern of the Wesenskern, the core. The argument which you find also in Husserl, and I will have to defer to Danielle here, is of the idea of essences of individuals. And in the case of human beings, each individual human being has a specific, has an individual essence, like the character of being Socrates belongs to Socrates. And Stein thinks that this character of being Socrates can be manifested in the Platonic Socrates, in the Xenophon Socrates, and in whatever historical recreated Socrates, or in the original. And they're all versions of this unfolding from the unique essence. So, first of all, there's a whole kind of metaphysics of essence that you find there that is present in Nietzsche, in Husserl, and is much more evident in Hering. And Stein really tries to develop it in Endliches und Ewiges Sein, because that's her sort of goal, is to add essentialist metaphysics on to the phenomenology. But I won't say more about the personalism, because here's something, I'll say this because I think it's somewhat controversial. Husserl archives have spent a great deal of effort trying to disentangle ideas too from what Stein did and from what Husserl did, and which goes completely contrary to Husserl's idea of cooperative philosophy. And there was even, and I have seen, we all have seen probably the advanced copy of the new version of Ideas too, where they've separated them out. But it isn't the case that Stein just stamped personalism all over Husserl. It's already there. And Husserl thinks of the person as a spiritual being. Already he refers to this in many of his lectures from, like, I think it's even in philosophy, it's a really science one usually. And this whole notion of a Geisteswelt and the human beings that belong to the world of spirit. So it's not just the influence of Stein on him. The relation of Scheler and Stein, of Scheler and Husserl, of course, is so agonistic that it's hard to capture here. But we have more to talk about.
Okay, so Kostas and Bernhard, and just keep it short and yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting, very helpful. My question revolves around the idea of intellectual intuition. Because at the start of your talk, you said that you want to differentiate the ego from the intellectual intuition. There are some thoughts on this, though, that intellectual intuition is, as we learned yesterday, the principle of all principles. The ego is the principle of all principles. So, by logic, they should be the same.
Yeah.
If you're not, then they are, if you're not, then you have contradiction. Maybe they are equiprimordial. Maybe this is an idea that you want to explore.
Yeah.
But given the other things you say about this sense of mindness and the ownership, intellectual intuition seems to account for the things you say. For example, as an auto-affection, right? Where you want, there is, in intellectual intuition, there's a kind of affection that's from the inside. And this seems to align with what you want to say.
Yeah. Well, a couple of just qualifying remarks. Probably we should be careful using the term intellectual intuition. I've written on the history of the meaning of the term intuition. We listened to some of it yesterday. And as you know, Kant denies that we have an intellectual intuition of anything. So you have to not use that word with regard to the ego cogito and Husserl. It's not an intellectual intuition. It is it's an immediate, in reflective mode. It's given with a sense of certainty and clarity and unstrikability that cannot be denied. But Husserl clearly says that the ego cogito is not this whole thing is not an inference. It's not a piece of logical reasoning. It's a direct intuition. It's not an intellectual intuition in the Kantian sense. So there's the whole discussion about that. We have to be careful about that. You said something else that was...
Auto-affection.
Auto-affection, yeah. There are some people who read that as already existing in Kant, but there's no doubt that we turn now to associate the concept with Husserl. But Selbstkonstitution des Ego, the self-constitution of the ego, is a concept you find in Husserl. So he thinks of the ego as constituting itself already passively in the flow of time consciousness. It's sort of like, it's sort of crystallizing like an iceberg or something like that in the flow of water. The ego is sort of already a kind of a gathering or coming together at the lower levels of, and onto that are then heaped all of the affections and emotions and drives and tendencies, and eventually you get up to the top ego, as it were, the boss ego. And that boss ego's task in transcendental philosophy is to come to self-awareness of its task of integrating all of this. So that's what's going on. I know what it was you said. You talked about equiprimordiality. I had a PhD student who wrote on the primordiality of self and world in Husserl, and he went to the labor of looking at Gleichursprünglichkeit in German, or originality or equiprimorality, doesn't appear in Husserl, not at all. So this is Heidegger's that's Heidegger's great contribution, is to speak about the equiprimordiality of Dasein and Sein in the world. But for Husserl, I think it's implicit that with the emerging of, I have a quote back there, with the emerging of the ego, the non-ego already comes to be. It's a Fichtean moment. It's already present in Husserl. So already with the emergence of the ego, there is the positing of the non-ego. It's a kind of Hegelian argument that to draw boundaries already to see what's beyond the boundary, you know. And I think that's present. So that later becomes captured as the notion of the life world or whatever. But the ego, there's a book, The Ego on Its Own. Does anyone know who wrote that book? A famous 19th century anarchist wrote a book called The Ego on Its Own. And as I say, the clue is in the title. but it's invoked by Shaler and others. They're always saying the ego is not on its own. And so the ownness of the ego is always an ownness that's mirrored in the other ego. So we haven't touched on that empathy notion, but the mirroring of egos, the recognition that you have a sphere of ownness like my sphere of ownness is the beginning of this sort of building of the intersubjectivity. But the ego on its own is a completely, just one thing, Shaler, since you mentioned him, and Husserl both refer to Robinson Crusoe. And they all say, there's no such thing. When Robinson Crusoe arrived at the desert island, he brought with him the world of London, and the tools and the concept of technique, etc., of his period. So you couldn't just, there's no sphere of, you couldn't strip down to the sphere of ownness. He's already embedded in the historical self.
Okay, and a really short answer.
Yeah, I can skip you can stop.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the paper is the paper in the folder, the full?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, of course. So we have less than 15 minutes for coffee, and we start with an online session.